Just when I tell you guys that we're not going to do any more conference realignment videos, I get pulled back into another one. But I will tell you, this one's different. We're not giving you any ideas of how we might get out or how we might break the grant of rights or anything like that. We're pretty done with that. We know that Florida State is going to get out of this conference. We understand the lawsuits. We understand all of that. We'll continue to cover it from that perspective, but this is something different. You guys and a few of you reached out and sent me videos on a Big 12 Mafia video that was really, really good about whether or not Florida State was a fit for the Big Ten. Now, they went through, and we'll talk about some of the things in their video that I agree with, disagree with, pretty spot on, pretty much kind of question. But I also want to look at the other side of that. Is the Big Ten a fit for Florida State? Something that I don't think people have talked about as much as what their video mostly focused on. If you haven't seen their video, you should go watch it. I'll link it in the description. They did a phenomenal job. Feel free to tag them in this, send it to them. They did a great job. If you're not following their work, they do a good job with a lot of the conference realignment stuff, and you should check them out. But let's jump right into it. And then, again, I want to talk to you a little bit here in a minute on the inverse. Is the Big Ten a good fit for Florida State? So the first thing they looked at was almost like a blue blood ranking, a all-time ranking of where Florida State fell in the national landscape. They looked at it amongst just Big Ten teams or teams that would be in the Big Ten. And Florida State comes in just after Penn State at 6th all-time. Now, again, this is just teams in the Big Ten, so you're not seeing some other national brands like Alabama and others in this. But Florida State comes in 6th all-time. Their kind of litmus test was around the number 10. Does Florida State kind of come in the top half of the conference? I'll give you the spoiler because we'll run through these quickly. Yes, Florida State comes in the top half of all of these. The one big disagreement that I would have with this, and they gave Florida State its props, was just the age of the programs when you look at it. In fact, I'll show you on the screen all of the programs in the nation, and you've got Alabama, USC, Oklahoma, Ohio State, Notre Dame, Michigan, Texas, Georgia, Nebraska, LSU, Tennessee, Penn State, FSU. You've got Clemson in Florida, and then Miami down there at 19th. Do you notice the big standout that's way different on Florida State's than everything else's? It's wins. They're 76th overall in wins, and no one else is even in 50 or beyond, right? The next closest is Miami at 46th. Florida State has significantly less wins than every other team in the country. And so when you think about Blue Bloods and you think about how Florida State has performed all time, they're at a very significant disadvantage. Why is that? Because they're so much younger than everyone else. Florida State has done more with less than any other team in the country. If Florida State's wins were as high as some of these other programs, if they were even in the top 40 in wins, they'd probably have more national titles, more Heismans, a better winning percentage, more all-time weeks in the AP, more All-Americans, more NFL draft picks. But they essentially are on par with everyone else despite playing so much less time. What Florida State has done in the last 40 or so years compared to everyone else's forever is remarkable. They have been the program of the last 30 or 40 years. There's no doubt about it. Now, Alabama's recent run, of course, you're not going to argue that over anything. But the big thing that I think Florida State has is that they've done it in so much less time than it's taken everyone else. I agree. Big 12 Mafia didn't necessarily, I'm not disagreeing with them on that. I just kind of disagree with the overall premise that Florida State's around 15th. No, they're way better when you consider how young they are. The next thing that Big 12 Mafia looked at in their rankings was the perception of recruits. And Florida State came in 5th, just behind Ohio State, Oregon, Penn State, and Michigan, ahead of USC, UCLA, Michigan State, and Maryland. The thing I would probably disagree with slightly on this is just the time factor. Recruits are young, and year to year matters a lot. And this is from 2 years ago. So Florida State has recruited better the last 2 years than they had under the first 2 years of Mike Norvell. In fact, they cracked the top 10 in recruiting this year. They also won 23 games out of 26 attempts during a 2-year span. Had that been taken into account, I think they'd be higher than a couple of teams here. Now, to be fair to Michigan, Michigan would probably be higher as well due to the fact that they won the national championship. But I'd slot Florida State in the third or fourth spot, either just ahead of Oregon and Penn State, maybe right even with Oregon. But again, Florida State's perception when they asked a bunch of recruits was still top half of the conference. In fact, it was about the top quarter. What about actual recruiting results? This was the talent composition of the team. Again, Florida State has not recruited up to their standard over the last 3 or 4 years, and they're still sixth in what would be the Big Ten. I think that if you were looking at the 2024 team talent composite, they'd likely be ahead of at least one, if not two more of these teams. Florida State, again, top quarter or so of the conference. The next thing they looked at was revenue, which Florida State, again, top half of the conference for sure, just behind Wisconsin, Nebraska, Oregon, ahead of them, Penn State also in striking distance. What I don't know if this includes is booster contributions or not. I don't know what all this entails. I know they took the media revenue out because obviously the Florida States would be much, much lower than the other teams. But this is a really cool graphic to see how Florida State's, when you look at, honestly, their licensing and their ads, what they're being able to sell through Learfield and then just selling gear and merchandise and stuff, Florida State up there with just about anybody. Ticket sales down because, again, this was through 21-22 when Florida State was losing a lot of games. But I guarantee you if this was through 23-24 where Florida State sold out just about every home game they had, they'd be ahead of Wisconsin in ticket sales. They'd probably be ahead of Oregon as well. And I think that'd be pretty interesting to look at. Florida State's financial situation, they had a surplus 2 years ago. And I think they'd be much, much higher in this if it was a little bit updated. The last one was TV viewing. Again, Florida State number 4 overall with a disclaimer that the ACC network is not counted in this. I don't necessarily know that the ACC network would put Florida State up above Penn State, but I think you'd get them pretty close to it where they'd be right around that number 3 mark. I know they wouldn't get up above Ohio State or Michigan, but I do think that Florida State and Penn State would be pretty close. They're neck and neck with Oregon there. And again, this includes a year that Florida State won 5 games in 2021. So Florida State certainly fits in from this perspective as well. When you look at all of this factored in, all of this put together, what you end up with is Florida State's right around 5th. Ohio State, Michigan, going to be your top 2. USC, going to be your number 3, 4 with Penn State. And then Florida State, Oregon right there after it. Again, I think if you sped it up a little bit, if you gave Florida State a little bit of a bump for perception, for on-field talent that they've got right now, financially where they're at, blue blood, again, I think Florida State's kind of getting undervalued there because of their newness. Florida State might even be like 3 or 4 on this thing. Now, I think 5's fine, right? 5 out of 19 would be fine. Florida State's clearly a fit for the Big Ten. And I think Big 12 Mafia absolutely showed this. But the big question I think we get to at that point is the Big Ten a fit for Florida State? I'll answer that in just a minute, but I do want to give some love to my guy, John Lojan, over at GotSpears.com. I keep showing you guys this. I keep pulling this thing out, and I keep trying to give him some love. Several of you have asked me and talked to me about ordering. I'm telling you, GotSpears.com is the best place to go get those spears. They've got, again, there's the picture of him with Norvell. He's got pictures with the beach volleyball team, the softball team. We've got a video of Michaela that I think you'll see here in a minute. Really, really good stuff. GotSpears.com. I know several of you have already ordered. I know others of you have asked about it. You can use the code TAKE50. I don't get anything from that. This is just me trying to give my guys some love. I don't get anything every time you use the code TAKE50. You get $50 off. That's his code that he's running right now through the end of the month. So make sure that you get it before February 1st. If you're local to Tallahassee, you can pick up and save on shipping. If you need it faster, there are rush options available. I love that spear flaming there on Florida's campus, which at our tailgate with them earlier this year. So GotSpears.com, my guy John will get you taken care of. If you email him, you can tell him that we sent you. But again, I don't need the credit. Just go order from him and get you a spear today. Is the Big Ten a fit for FSU? Academically, I'd say yes. Every time we do a video on the Big Ten, I get a comment. Well, they're not an AAU school, so they won't fit. It's just not going to work. Brett McMurphy came out, blew a hole right in that. I think we understand now that that's not a requirement. It's a preference. But Brett McMurphy's tweets from earlier last year prove that that's no longer a requirement, not something that the Big Ten will certainly hold Florida State to tooth and nail. I think that Florida State will have an AAU accreditation membership soon. So I think that even if that was a requirement, they would have it in enough time to make things make sense. But again, not a requirement as of day one. Geography, I don't think that is a fit. Now, what the Big Ten is doing is going to a nationwide, a countrywide aspect, right? Where the SEC is staying very regionalized in the Southeast. The Big Ten is going to a nationwide conference. They're going to have the four corners if they can get down into Florida. I think that's a big deal for them. And I think that that is a positive. But for the fans, I don't know that the Big Ten is necessarily a geographical fit. I don't know that it's a matchup fit. I think that fans would prefer to stay closer, to be playing teams like Alabama and Georgia and things that you can get to relatively easily, as opposed to having to go to Columbus, USC, Oregon, and all over the country. Now, some of that stuff is going to be fun. I know that it's going to be fun to go to Oregon. I know that it's going to be fun to go to Southern Cal at some point. I understand all that. However, does that make sense for your other sports? Does that make sense if you don't have a Southeastern partner? If Clemson or UNC or Miami isn't in with you, maybe it makes it a little bit tougher. Geographically, matchup-wise, I don't think as good of a fit. I'll just be honest. I think fans would rather see Florida State, Georgia than Florida State, Michigan. I think they'd rather see Florida State, Alabama than Florida State, Ohio State. Not that they wouldn't want to see those matchups. I just think that the matchup, the style of play, favors an SEC fit a little bit more. What about the style of play? Man, that is so tough because the style of play in college football changes all the time. It seems like it never stops changing. And so that's a big question, but would it work? Would the style of play work? Well, man, the Big Ten itself has so many different styles. You look at Washington and Oregon coming in new. You look at the way that Ohio State plays versus the way that Iowa plays, and it is completely different. I know that we think of the Big Ten as big smash mouth football, but that is going to change some with Oregon, Washington, the way that Ohio State plays, and others. Now, the way that Michigan and the way that Wisconsin, the way that Penn State, and the way that others play, yes, it is. I get it. Florida State's somewhat of a balance of both. They very much value the trenches. They very much value both sides of the line of scrimmage, but they're also not afraid to run and gun and play a little bit. I think stylistically they probably match up better with SEC schools, but I don't necessarily think that style is a way that they don't fit. Ultimately, is the Big Ten a fit for Florida State? We know that Florida State is a fit for the Big Ten for so many reasons and so much that it brings them, but does the Big Ten make the sense for the Noles? I think ultimately, yes. I think that because of the money that would come in, we haven't talked about the revenue. We've done that in other videos. You can go check out wherever on the page. I think that the money situation, the academic situation, the matchups that you would be getting, the geography, though, it may not be the most ideal, works. It's a nationwide approach. And then I think the style. I think Florida State splits the styles of the two kind of coming together. I think it is a fit. Now, is it as much of a fit as the SEC? I don't know. I couldn't tell you that. I think that Florida State has always kind of been thought of as an SEC-type program. Would they fit into the SEC? Great. Absolutely they would. Is the Big Ten a little bit of a weird matchup, a little bit of a weird partnership? Probably. But I do think that it's something that could work very, very well. If Florida State was to get into the Big Ten, I think it would do something crazy for the SEC versus the Big Ten, the way that both conferences are thought of. I started a national channel, and I'd love for you guys to go check out my take on that, and you can do so by clicking right here.